beacon had been burning for 11 hours before anyone answered it. Commander Brace Wayland watched it pulse on the tactical display, a slow, ugly red throb against the dark, and felt the particular kind of exhaustion that lives behind the eyes. Not the exhaustion of sleep deprivation, though he had that too. The deeper kind. The kind that comes from understanding exactly how much trouble you are in and being completely unable to do anything about it yet. Still nobody on the relay, he said. Nothing, said Dex Garin from the secondary console. Was 23 years old and had been Wayland's junior partner on Relay Station Gotham for 8 months. He had the kind of face that still looked surprised when bad things happened, which Wayland had decided was either a profound strength or a terminal liability. He hadn't worked out which. I've cycled through every frequency we're authorized for. Broad spectrum on the civilian bands. Nothing. Either nobody's listening or the signal isn't getting out, Wayland finished. Dex turned from the console slowly. The Vethkari? Wayland looked at the emergency beacon, the distress pulse, old as space travel, the signal that was supposed to mean something to anyone within 40 light minutes who had a receiver and a conscience, and said nothing for a moment. The station groaned around them, not structurally. Gotham Station was solid 40-year-old construction, union grade. It groaned the way all old stations groaned in deep space, a settling of metal against the cold, a language of contractions and expansions that Wayland had learned to read like weather in a former life. This groan was different. This one felt like the station itself was nervous. Maybe the situation had stood 72 hours ago. It had started, specifically, with a cargo freighter called the Whitmore's Crossing going off course 11,000 kilometers from the station. Not engine trouble, not navigation error. The Whitmore's Crossing had simply stopped responding to its own helm. Its pilot, a 14-year Union veteran named Caro Tessin, had later told Wayland that the controls had locked solid under his hands, like they'd been welded in place, and that the ship had turned herself toward the inner belt and begun accelerating. He'd been helpless. He'd watched his own hands on the stick do nothing. The stick do nothing. Every override he'd ever been taught do nothing. The ship had been recovered. Caro Tessin had been unharmed, but the Whitmore's Crossing had arrived at her diverted destination, a nameless waypoint in the inner debris field, 5 hours late and 1,800 kilograms of processed lanthanide crystals lighter. The cargo bay had been clean, not forced, not cut, just empty like the lanthanides had never been there, and the manifest falsified to show delivery complete. 2 days later, a passenger shuttle running the Gotham to Reach corridor had been hijacked the same way. This time there were passengers, 6 of them. One of them was a journalist named Vika Vale, who worked for the RIM correspondence, and who had been on her way to cover a mining dispute in the outer belt. The shuttle had deviated, landed briefly on a chunk of unnamed rock, and 4 of the 6 passengers had been removed. Vika Vale and a retired mineral surveyor named Donis had been left behind, sitting in the locked passenger cabin, the shuttle doors sealed from outside. Vika Vale had not been frightened. She had been photographing. She'd had the presence of mind, or the professional reflex, to pull out her press-grade imager and start documenting everything she could see through the passenger windows. She had 312 images of rock, shadow, and equipment being unloaded from the shuttle's cargo hold. She also had, in image 291, something she hadn't understood at the time, a shadow that didn't have a body attached to it. She'd brought those images to Wayland when the shuttle returned, when the controls simply released themselves and the autopilot had ferried them home, like nothing had happened. She'd walked into Gotham Station's command level with her imager bag over her shoulder and the specific expression of someone who has decided they are not going to be afraid because being afraid is not useful right now. And she'd said, "I want to talk to whoever's in charge of security for this sector." Wayland had looked at image 291 for a long time. The shadow was wrong in the way that made his stomach shift. It was cast by the sun, the distant, white-yellow star that lit this system with the conviction of something that didn't know or care what happened in its light, and it fell at the correct angle for the time and position. But there was nothing above it, nothing casting it, just the shadow of a figure, roughly humanoid in outline, crouching beside the shuttle's port-side cargo hatch. "What do you think that is?" Vika Vale had asked. "I think," said Wayland very carefully, "that someone doesn't want to be seen." That was 30 hours ago. Since then, Wayland had sent his distress beacon and gotten silence, cataloged 7 more incidents of vehicle hijacking across the sector, ranging from cargo barges to a geological survey skimmer, and established that whatever was doing this had a range of approximately 50 light minutes from a central point. He'd run the geometry twice, then made Dex run it once more to be sure. The central point came out somewhere in the inner belt, in the debris. The Vethkari, Dex said again, quieter this time, like he was testing the words. The Vethkari were not a well-known species to most people in the Rim settlements. They were known to Union intelligence and to the people who read the classified briefings that Wei Lan, as a sector commander, was authorized to receive. They were known because 3 years ago, a Union research outpost in the Tessalon system had gone dark, and when the relief ship arrived, they'd found the outpost empty and intact and cold, every system shut down, the crew simply gone. No bodies, no sign of forced entry. The manifest showed 3 pieces of advanced research equipment missing: a prototype subspace modulator, an experimental neural interface array, and a device that the outpost's lead researcher, Professor Dono Hamill, had called a remote orientation override. The RU. Hamill had been working on it for civilian purposes: remote navigation assistance for damaged vessels, automated course correction for unmanned cargo drones. The theory was elegant: a signal that could interface with a ship's base navigation architecture, bypassing the helm entirely, taking direct control of thrust, attitude, and heading within a 50 light-minute radius, powered in Hamill's prototype by a cluster of processed lanthanide crystals. The crystals were disappearing across the sector. Wei Lan looked at Dex. Dex looked at Wei Lan. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was, "We are 2 people on a station with minimal armament in a sector where an alien intelligence has stolen a device that can take control of any ship we might try to escape in, and our distress beacon has been running for 11 hours and no one has answered. Start logging everything," Wei Lan said. "Every incident, every timestamp, every piece of evidence Vika brought us. We are building a record in case we can't do anything else." Dex turned back to his console. He pulled up the log interface, and then he paused and he said, quietly, without turning around, "Boss, are we going to be okay?" Wei Lan considered lying. He was good at the kind of lying that was really just calibrated optimism, the kind that keeps people functional. He'd been doing it since his first posting, 20 years ago, when he'd been young enough to be surprised by bad things himself. "We're going to find out," he said, which was the truth, which, in its own way, was worse than the lie would have been. The first thing Wei Lan did was go over everything Vika Vale had brought him. She'd set herself up in the station's small media room, a repurposed storage bay with a fold-down table, a screen, and lighting that someone had optimized for working rather than comfort. And she had her images sorted, annotated, and cross-referenced in a system that made Wei Lan feel briefly inadequate. She was methodical in the way of someone who has spent years extracting truth from noise. "These 4, she said, pointing to a cluster of images on the right side of her screen. "These are the most important. Not because of what they show, but because of what they don't show. Look at the shadows." Wei Lan leaned in. The shadows were there, cast by equipment, by the shuttle hull, by the rock formations around the landing site. All of them consistent. All of them correct for a single light source. And moving through those shadows, causing them to stretch and pool in ways that had no visible cause, were the traces, the impressions, the displacement of dust that a boot makes when a boot is there, even when the boot is not visible. "Optical camouflage," Wei Lan said. "That's my working theory." Vika sat back. "I've been a journalist for 12 years. I've covered 3 border incidents and a corporate war. I have never seen anything like this. But here's what's interesting." She tapped image 291 again. They were careful. Whatever this is, it didn't want to be documented. But it also didn't seem to understand that a shadow has to come from somewhere. It didn't account for the angle. It was in a hurry. Or it didn't think we could track it. She looked at him. Her eyes were the kind of steady gray-green that made Wei Lan think of deep water. "What are we dealing with, Commander? And don't give me the official version." He told her about the Tessalon outpost, about the Aru, about the lanthanide crystals and the 50 light-minute radius and the geometric center in the inner belt. He watched her face as he talked. She didn't flinch. She asked 3 questions, sharp, specific, the questions of someone who was already building the story in her head. When he was done, she said,
"Carter, what?"
"One of the other passengers, the ones who were taken. His name was Carter. I've been trying to reach him through Rimcom and not getting anything. He was traveling alone. He'd boarded at Reach with what he said was a private exploration license." She pulled up a passenger manifest on her screen. He listed his occupation as research assistant. But here's the thing. She pointed to a data field. His registered employer? Dono Hamill. Wayland was still for a moment. Hamill, he said. The same Hamill who built the Rue. Yes. She folded her hands on the table. I don't think Carter was taken. I think Carter got off. The silence in the media room had a different quality after that. They found the glove in the docking corridor 2 days later. Not a human glove. Wayland couldn't have said exactly what it was at first. It looked like a shed skin, almost thin and faintly iridescent, the color of deep water on a planet with a green sun. Dex found it wedged under the lip of the airlock threshold, and he'd called Wayland with the practiced calm of someone who had decided to present alarming information in the most neutral possible voice. Wayland turned it over in his gloved hands. It was the right size for a human hand, roughly, but the finger structure was wrong. 4 fingers, slightly too long, with joints in the wrong places. The material was optical diffraction polymer, he was almost certain. The kind that bent light around itself. When he held it at the correct angle, it vanished, and what remained was a faint shimmer, the outline of absence. He put it under the station's analysis array, the same compact lab equipment used for mineral assay and atmospheric sampling, and ran every test he knew how to run. The polymer had a surface coating, and in that coating, in the microscopic channels left by use and friction, there was a biological residue. Not human. The array didn't have Vethkari tissue profiles in its database. Of course it didn't, but it didn't need a match to tell him things. The residue was organic, carbon-based, and it contained a lipid signature he'd never seen in any terrestrial biology. More importantly, it contained partial print patterns. Not fingerprints, exactly. More like pressure architecture. The impression of how a hand holds things, how it grips, the unique mechanical signature of a particular individual's grip. Can you run that against anything? Dex asked. Not directly. Wayland looked at the data. But I can compare it to any future samples. If whoever this belongs to touches anything else on this station, or any surface we can access. He stopped. The shuttle. Did we pull the environmental log before they cleaned it? Dex was already moving. They had pulled the log. The environmental log of a modern shuttle recorded micropressure data from every surface, a passive system, designed to track wear and structural fatigue, that incidentally recorded the complete mechanical signature of every contact made with every interior surface. Dex ran the comparison in 40 minutes, which was fast. Wayland watched the result come up on his screen and felt something shift in his chest. Not quite hope, but the precursor to hope, the chemical signal of a trail becoming visible. The grip signature from the glove matched 11 contact points inside the passenger cabin of Vika's shuttle. Specifically, it matched the surfaces around the exterior door mechanism and the cargo access panel. It was inside the cabin, Vika said, when Wayland showed her. She'd gone still in the particular way of someone processing something that is both what they expected and worse than they expected. It was inside with me while I was photographing. It was invisible, Wayland said. You couldn't have seen it, but it could see me. She picked up her imager from the table. She turned it over in her hands. The expression on her face was thoughtful rather than frightened, which Wayland found himself actively grateful for. Do you know who it is, the one who owns that glove? I have a theory, he hesitated. Carter, Hamill's research assistant. If Hamill built the RU and someone wanted it, the fastest route to both the device and the knowledge of how to operate it would be through someone close to Hamill. Someone who had access. Someone who could hand it over from the inside. Carter sold him out, or Carter was Carter all along, and the man we thought was Hamill's loyal assistant was something else entirely. Wayland set down the analysis printout. The Vethkari don't just observe from orbit. That much we know from the Tessalon incident. They operate through proxies. They put assets in place. They're patient. He paused. And they're very good at being someone nobody suspects. The distress beacon was still running. The answer came not from a Union vessel, but from a private comm signal bouncing off the relay network, a fragmentary, static-laden transmission that resolved, after 3 passes through the enhancement filters, into the voice of Commissioner Jara Gorton. Gorton was the Union administrator for the Outer Rim sectors, a broad-shouldered woman in her late 50s, who had the voice of someone who had given difficult orders for long enough that difficult orders no longer required preparation. She operated out of a station called Precinct Hub, 12 light hours out. She'd received Wayland's beacon on a backup receiver. Her primary comms had been, she paused here, and Wayland heard something in that pause, experiencing interference. The Rue, Wayland said. We've had 6 vessels deviate in the last 32 hours, Gordon said. I've been trying to reach you for most of that time. I'm sending a support team, but they're coming in dark. No active nav beacons, manual helm, nothing the RU can latch onto. Old school. It'll take them 40 hours. Another pause. Can you hold? Wayland looked at Dex. Dex looked at the tactical display with the quiet expression of someone doing arithmetic they don't entirely want to finish. We'll hold, Wayland said. He clicked off the comm and stood with his hands on the console and breathed for a moment. 40 hours. 40 hours with an invisible alien intelligence operating somewhere within the station's perimeter, a hijack device that could take control of any vessel they tried to use to escape, and a theory, a good theory. He believed it was a good theory, but a theory that hadn't yet given him the one thing he needed, a face. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. That was, Wayland had concluded, a deliberate choice. It had started 3 hours after Gorton's transmission, while Wayland was in the station's maintenance corridor, running a diagnostic on the external sensor array. He'd been working alone. Dex was at the comms post, Vika was in the media room, and the voice had simply appeared in the air around him, resonant and slightly wrong in the way of something that had learned human speech from recordings rather than conversation. Commander Wayland. He didn't move. He finished the diagnostic step he was on, a small, deliberate act of refusal, and then he set down his tool and turned slowly. The corridor was empty. The overhead lights cast long shadows between the cable runs and the pipe brackets. Nothing was there. I prefer you not to pretend surprise, the voice said. You are not a man given to surprise. It would be inefficient. All right. Wayland crossed his arms. He noted, with the focused attention of someone who has decided that information is survival, that the voice was coming from slightly to his left and approximately 2 meters away. He could see a faint shimmer in the air there if he didn't look at it directly. The same optical distortion he now associated with the diffraction. Polymer. What do you want? The station, the voice said. Specifically your active compliance in its transfer. The Vethkari have identified Relay Station Gotham as a strategically necessary node. Your comms relay covers 31 active settlements. Control of this node provides control of information flow across your entire rim sector. Wayland considered this. He considered what it would mean. He considered that the Vethkari were not, to his knowledge, inherently violent. The Tessalon incident had produced 0 bodies, but that not inherently violent and safe to cooperate with were not the same thing. And if I say no, then I continue. The voice was calm, almost conversational. I have, as of this morning, established control of 43 vessels within my operational radius. I have the lanthanide reserves to extend that radius significantly. I have time. I have patience. A pause. What I do not have is interest in unnecessary conflict. This is a business arrangement. The Vethkari are efficient, Commander. We do not destroy what we can repurpose. The people on those hijacked ships, Wayland said. The passengers who were taken. What happened to them? The shimmer shifted. It moved slightly, a reorientation, and Wayland tracked it with his peripheral vision without moving his eyes. They are unharmed. They have been relocated to the secondary facility. They will be returned when this matter is resolved. The secondary facility. Your base in the inner belt. Silence. Briefly. You are well informed. I'm a relay commander. I process information for a living. He paused. I want to see them. The hostages. Proof of life before I consider any arrangement. Another silence, longer. That is, acceptable. You will be contacted with transport coordinates within 6 hours. You will come alone. Wayland nodded. He said nothing about the fact that he was already doing geometry in his head. The coordinates, the trajectory, the way a vessel might navigate to an inner belt base without using its active nav systems, without giving the RU anything to latch onto. He said nothing about Dex. Dex said absolutely not. Sit down. You're going alone to an alien base in the inner belt where there's a device that can hijack any ship you try to leave in. Dex sat down. He had the particular frustration of the young and competent who have been overruled, which manifested as a very controlled expression and slightly elevated breathing. Wayland recognized it because he'd had it himself, once, for most of his 20s. I'm not going alone, Wayland said. Dex looked up. I'm going first. You're following at a 15-minute offset. Different heading, using the old survey route 7. It's in the station's nav database, pre-digital, not accessible to any digital interface. You'll need to calculate your course adjustments by hand. He slid a paper chart across the console. Paper. Actual paper. which the station kept in its emergency stores, along with manual override keys and other things that had been obsolete for decades, but which someone, long ago, had decided to keep, because occasionally the universe surprises you. The RU locks onto digital navigation systems. It can't interface with manual helm control. Not according to what we know about Hamill's design specs. You'll fly it yourself. Eyes and hands. No automation. Dex looked at the chart. He looked at Wayland. What are you going to be doing for 15 minutes? Making enough noise that our contact doesn't look behind himself. It was not, Wayland knew, a perfect plan. It was the plan that existed given the materials available, which was the only kind of plan that mattered. He had spent 20 years building plans out of inadequate materials and executing them with the conviction that commitment was a force multiplier, that the difference between a good plan and a bad one was often simply the quality of the executions. He also had another card. He hadn't told Dex about it yet because it required Dex to not know about it in order for it to work. He'd spent the previous night preparing a disguise. The coordinates resolved to a stretch of the inner belt that looked, on scanner, like nothing in particular. A scatter of carbonaceous chondrite fragments, unremarkable, the kind of debris field that existed in millions of systems across human space and that nobody thought twice about. Wayland approached in a single-person survey skimmer with its nav system dark, flying manual, the way he'd been trained to fly before automation became standard. He'd used to hum when he flew manually, a song his mother had sung to him, a low repetitive melody from one of the old settlements. Not words, really, just a sound, a shape in the air that meant safety. He caught himself doing it now without deciding to, his lips moving soundlessly over the familiar intervals, and he didn't stop himself. There was no one to see it. It kept his hands steady. He was not flying as himself. He'd assembled the disguise from what was available. Maintenance coveralls, a modified helmet with opaque visor, an identifier badge pulled from the station's incoming cargo logs that corresponded to a private transport operator named Evan Nolan, who had been in the area 3 weeks ago. He'd modified his gait deliberately, the way he'd been taught in his first intelligence cross-training session 20 years ago. The body says as much as the face. He'd worked it out in front of the station's water recycler, the only reflective surface big enough to check his full silhouette. The result wasn't perfect. It was good enough to get him inside. The base entrance was a cave mouth in a tumbling rock approximately 4 kilometers across. A landing pad had been cut into the rock face, smooth, recent, nothing on any official survey. He set the skimmer down and walked inside with the deliberate, unhurried movement of someone who belongs somewhere. There were humans inside. That was the first thing. There were humans working alongside the Vethkari, doing it with the practiced ease of people who had been here long enough to know the routines, carrying equipment, monitoring displays, moving through the carved rock corridors with the purposeful distraction of colleagues rather than captives, not slaves. Workers. Carter, Wayland thought. Carter and others like him. People who had been recruited or purchased or simply offered enough that they'd said yes to something they'd regret later. It was an old story. It was a human story, which was somehow both comforting and dispiriting. The Vethkari themselves were visible now, not invisible, here in their own space, moving without the diffraction polymer that hid them among human populations. They were taller than a person, broad through the chest and narrow at the waist, with skin that was deeply pigmented in shifting iridescent patterns. They had 4-fingered hands. They moved with the particular certainty of a species that had for a long time not needed to worry about who was watching. Wayland walked. He counted. He memorized. The RU was here. He saw it in the central chamber, a device the size of a large appliance, housed in a cradle of equipment he didn't entirely recognize, but whose function he could infer. Lanthanide crystals were racked along the wall to its left. The chamber was guarded, but not heavily. 3 Vethkari operators and 2 human technicians, one of whom was eating something from a sealed container and looking at a display with the faraway expression of someone who has been doing the same task for long enough to do it in their sleep. In the side chamber, through a partially open pressure door, Wayland could see the hostages. He counted 5. He recognized 2 of them from the passenger manifests. They were sitting, not restrained, sitting with the coiled restlessness of people who were unharmed but deeply aware of their situation. One of them was looking at the pressure door. When he looked at the pressure door, he was looking, without knowing it, directly at Wayland. Wayland made a small gesture, barely a movement, just the flicker of 2 fingers, a signal he'd used in collaborative ops decades ago. Hold, I see you. Wait. The man's eyes moved away. He didn't react. He was good. Wayland moved deeper into the base. He was looking for the communication hub, the node through which the Vethkari commander coordinated with the surface assets, with Carter, with the human proxies. He needed to know the architecture before Dex arrived. He needed to find the thing that would give him the name he still didn't have. The face behind the operation, the one who had given Carter his orders, the intelligence that had designed all of this. He found it in a corner office, which was both obvious and, in retrospect, exactly right. The Vethkari were efficient. The command node would be in the most defensible position with the best sightlines to the primary operations chamber. He'd have put it there himself. The displays were running in Vethkari script, a flowing, angular notation that Wayland couldn't read. But interfaces have a grammar that transcends language. He could read the structure. He could see the command hierarchy in the way the screens were oriented and the data flows arranged, and what he could see was this. There were two principles, not one. Two command signatures, two authorization levels that separated the operational commander from the strategic director. The strategic director was listed with a designation he didn't know, but the operational commander, the one currently active, the one coordinating the base's day-to-day hijacking operations, was logging commands under an identifier that included, in the Unicode translation field, a name, Carter, and beside it in a subordinate field that should have been matching, a twin entry, logging from a different terminal, showing different authorization credentials, but the same originating biological signature. Not Carter, Carter's brother. Wayland stood very still. The scale of it assembled itself in his mind with the unpleasant efficiency of a thing that has been true all along and was only now letting itself be seen. There were two of them. The one he'd identified as Carter, the one who'd gotten off the shuttle, who wore the diffraction polymer, who had handed Hamill's device to the Vethkari, was the operational face. His twin was something else, the planted asset, the one who had been moved into Hamill's life years ago, establishing trust, waiting. Hamill hadn't been a willing collaborator. He'd been a mark, his own assistant, his trusted research partner, had been a Vethkari proxy from the beginning. Wayland thought about Vika's image, the shadow that didn't have a body. He thought about the 11 contact points in the shuttle cabin. He thought about the fact that Carter, the one he'd been pursuing, had twin-matched signatures in Vethkari logs, which meant the Vethkari had not known, or had not cared, that they were using two people rather than one. The strategic layer of this operation had been run through both brothers, separate chains, different handlers, which meant that if you broke one chain, the other didn't know. And if the other didn't know, you had the element of surprise. Wayland reached into his coverall pocket and triggered the personal beacon he'd set to transmit on the manual survey Route 7 frequency. One pulse. The signal that said, "I'm here. I have what we need, come in." He had 15 minutes before Dex arrived. He went back to the hostage chamber. The lock on the pressure door was a Vethkari magnetic seal system, which was not the same as a human magnetic seal but was operating on the same physical principles. And Wayland had been picking locks since he was 19 years old, and doing things he wasn't supposed to be doing in places he wasn't supposed to be. He worked fast, using a tool he'd brought specifically for this, a calibrated emitter disguised as a maintenance scanner, which produced a field strong enough to cycle a magnetic seal without triggering the hardwired intrusion alarm. It took 4 minutes. The door opened. The 5 hostages looked at him. He recognized in their faces the particular quality of people who have been waiting in controlled conditions for too long, not broken, not panicked, but coiled with the specific tension of people who have had nothing to do but think. The man who had looked at the pressure door, heavy-set, calm, in his 50s, stood up first. "Your station Gotham," the man said. "Commander Wayland, we're getting you out." He moved to the back of the chamber, checking sight lines through the door. Can everyone move under their own power? 4 yeses, 1 hesitation, a younger woman with a wrapped ankle. Not a break, probably a sprain from the shuttle's rough diversion landing. She could move. "There's a skimmer at the cave entrance. Survey class, fit 6. We need to reach it before." The explosion happened before he finished the sentence. Not an explosion exactly, not destructive, but a power surge somewhere in the base's distribution network that hit the overhead lights with a blue-white pulse and dropped them into emergency. Red illumination and caused simultaneously every display in the operations chamber to go momentarily dark. In that darkness, Wayland heard the specific sound of confusion, Vethkari communication, a fast clicking and resonance language that he associated with urgency, and the secondary sound of a fight beginning in the corridor. Dex had not waited 15 minutes. Dex had apparently waited 11 minutes and 40 seconds, then come in hard and fast through the secondary entrance, an intake shaft on the rock formation's far side that Wayland had identified on the base schematics and mentioned, in passing, while explaining Survey Route 7, and had somehow, in the chaos of his entry, hit the power distribution relay. Later, when Wayland asked him how, Dex said, "I tripped." But that was later. Right now, Wayland said to the 5 hostages, "Follow me, don't stop, don't look back, run if I run." He went out the door. The operations chamber in Emergency Red was a different space. The familiar clarity of full lighting gone, replaced by shadows and the elongated geometry of emergency strips. The Vethkari operators were efficient and trained, and 2 of them had regrouped near the Ruru device while a third moved toward the hostage chamber. Wayland hit the third one first, shoulder first, driving low, the old close quarters technique that worked regardless of how much bigger your opponent was, and felt the Vethkari's reflexes kick in, with a speed that was faster than human, which he'd expected, so he didn't try to win the exchange cleanly. He redirected rather than blocked, used the being's own momentum, and put it into the wall hard enough to ring the stone. He was already moving. The 2 human technicians were not combatants. One had his hands up, the other had vanished entirely, which Wayland decided was the most sensible response and mentally filed as not his problem. The hostages were out, moving through the chamber, following his line toward the corridor. He heard the fight behind him, Dex's voice, briefly, saying something profane in the direction of what sounded like a large piece of equipment falling, and then Dex himself appeared from the left-hand corridor, breathing hard, a smear of something dark across his left forearm, moving at a dead run. "Got the relay," Dex said, not slowing. "Whatever that does. It means the Rue doesn't know where our ship is," Wayland said, running alongside him. "Good. Because I didn't bring ours. I took the Vethkari shuttle." Wayland processed this. "You stole their shuttle. It was right there." The door was open. Dex glanced at him with the expression of someone who has done something extremely stupid that has, so far, worked. "I flew it here manually. They don't have a manual lockout. Their internal systems are all automated. So I just..." He made a gesture that suggested the straightforward simplicity of the act. Turned the wheel. The Vethkari shuttle was, in fact, sitting on the secondary landing pad with its door open. It was larger than Wayland's skimmer and shaped like nothing a human engineer would have. Designed, wide and flat, with a thruster arrangement that looked wrong until you understood the aerodynamic principles involved, and then looked wrong in a different way. There was a pilot's seat of sorts. There were controls of a kind. "You flew this," Wayland said. "It's not that different." Dex was already at the controls, and the quality of his attention when he was working with machines was the thing that had made Wayland trust him in the first place. That focused, absorbed intelligence that forgot everything except the problem in front of it. Thrust is thrust. Attitude is attitude. The geometry is the same. "Load everyone," Wayland said to the hostages. He turned back to the cave mouth. "Give me 2 minutes." He went back in. Not for the Rue. He didn't need the Rue. That was a recovery operation for Commissioner Gorton's team. He went back for the data. The command node display was still running in emergency power. Still showing the 2 authorization streams. Still showing the twin signatures. He pulled the physical data module from its housing. Small, the size of a thumb, but containing the entire operational record. The command logs, the authorization chains, the communications between Carter, his brother, and the Vethkari strategic director. A name, a face. Everything needed to find them all the way to the top. He felt a presence behind him and turned. The Vethkari commander was there, the diffraction polymer down, visible in the emergency red light. It was not Carter. Carter was human. This was the Vethkari officer, the operational director, who had been running the hijacking program, and it was tall and its patterned skin was cycling through colors that Wayland associated, from what little he knew of Vethkari behavioral biology, with anger. It held a weapon, a directed energy emitter, pointed at him. Wayland held up the data module. "This is your operational record," he said. "Your command logs. Your comm channels to Carter. Your comm channels to Carter's brother. Your strategic director's authorization signatures." He paused. "If this reaches Commissioner Gorton, your entire network in this sector is done. Every proxy, every asset." The Vethkari said something. Its voice, without the synthesizer it used to speak to him in the corridor, was a layered resonance. a chord rather than a tone. "I know you can speak," Wayland said. "I heard you earlier, in the maintenance corridor." A pause. "The module," it said, in that wrong cadenced speech. "Give it." "No, then I will." "You'll what?" Wayland kept his voice level. He was thinking about the hostages. He was thinking about Dex at the controls. He was thinking about Vika Vielle, who was currently on Gotham Station, with a 312-image record of the operation on a transmission timer that would fire automatically if Wayland missed his check-in. He was thinking about the data module in his hand and the 40 hours until Gorton's support team arrived, and the fact that he was not, despite appearances, out of options. "You'll kill me and take the module, and the record still reaches Gorton in 4 hours, because I set a dead man's trigger before I left the station. You know I did. You'd have done the same." The weapon stayed up. "Or," Wayland said, "you let me walk out of here with the module. Your people are already detained, the ones Dex hit. The Rue relay is broken. You have no vehicle control, no communication back to your strategic command." He paused. "Surrender and I speak for you to Gorton, Union legal process. No field action." The energy emitter was pointed at his chest, and the Vethkari officer was 4 meters away, and Wayland was acutely aware that the next 5 seconds would determine the character of a very large number of things. Vika Vale walked through the door. She walked through the door with her imager in her hands, and she pointed it at the Vethkari officer. And she said, with the specific calm of someone who has done exactly this before, "Look at the lens." The officer looked at the lens. The flash fired. Automatic, mechanical, nothing digital for the Rue to touch. The image captured at 1,000th of a second, sharp and unambiguous. The Vethkari officer's face fully resolved in the emergency red light, weapon raised, in the command node of an illegal operation in human space. "Evidence," Vika said, lowering the imager. She looked at the officer with those steady gray-green eyes. "You're going to be very famous, in a bad way." The weapon came down. Later, much later, after Commissioner Gorton's team had arrived in their dark-running vessel, after the Rue had been recovered, and the Vethkari officers detained under joint Union-Vethkari treaty protocols, after the 5 hostages had been reunited with families, and the data module had been handed over to Gorton's intelligence attaché in the Carter. Brothers had been identified, separated, and placed into custody. Wayland sat in the station's small break room with a cup of coffee and the particular internal silence of someone who has been running too fast for too long and has finally stopped. The coffee was bad. It was always bad on deep space stations because the water recycling process did something to the mineral content that no amount of filtration entirely corrected. He drank it anyway. It was a human thing to do, to drink bad coffee in a bad chair in a small room that smelled of recycled air and machine oil. And he was feeling very human right now. Dex came in and poured himself a cup and sat down across from him and said nothing for a while. "The twin thing," Dex finally said. "I still don't understand the twin thing." Carter, the one we'd identified as the operative, was the direct link to the Vethkari command, Wayland said. His brother had been inserted into Hamill's life years ago, a long-term asset, built up trust, access, understanding of the research. When the Rue was close enough to completion, he handed the specs and the device to Carter, who handed them up the chain. And Hamill didn't know. Hamill thought he'd hired a research assistant. He thought the man who'd worked with him for 4 years was his colleague. Wayland looked at his coffee. Hamill was prepared to confess to the whole thing. Take the blame. He thought Carter, the brother, had been coerced. It took the intelligence team 3 hours to untangle it. He paused. The wizard's identity. All along it was the person nobody suspected because they seemed the least likely. The quiet one. The helpful one. The one who was just always there. "The one right in front of everyone," Dex said. "The one right in front of everyone." Vika Vale came in and poured coffee and sat at the 3rd chair and wrinkled her nose at the first sip and said, "This is terrible." "Welcome to deep space," Wayland said. She looked at him for a moment, the steady gray-green eyes. "You knew I'd follow. I knew you'd follow." He agreed. "I didn't ask you to because if I'd asked you, you would have decided whether to agree. If I didn't ask you, you would just do what you were going to do anyway, which was follow." "Which was follow." She held up her imager. "I've got the full record. The image of the officer, the base documentation, the victim testimonies. The Carter brothers' capture is going to be the first major HFI story the Rim has had in 3 years." She paused. "HFI humanity finds a way. That's the phrase. I know the phrase. Do you want to know what the actual headline is?" Wayland leaned back in his chair. He looked at the bad coffee and the bad ceiling and the recycled air and the wall of the station, and beyond the wall, The deep dark in which humans had planted themselves stubbornly, expensively, with questionable wisdom and enormous persistence, across a stretch of space that had been empty before them and was now improbably home. "Go ahead," he said. Vika looked at her imager screen. 2 humans in a station with no backup, no armament, and a stolen map face down an alien intelligence network in one. How, same as always, they didn't stop. That's not a headline. That's 3 sentences. "I'm still working on it." Dex laughed. It was the laugh of someone who has recently been more afraid than they expected to be and has come out the other side and found, to their surprise, that the other side is a break room with bad coffee and people they trust. It was a good laugh. It filled the small room. Wayland finished his coffee. He thought about the survey chart, actual paper, in his pocket, the hand-drawn course corrections for Survey Route 7, the analog road through a digital world. He thought about the hum he'd caught himself humming in the cockpit, the melody from his childhood, the one without words, the one that meant you are still here, you are still moving, you will find your way through. He thought about Gorton, who had said, "Can you hold?" And he had said, "We'll find out." They had found out. Outside the station's windows, small, reinforced, scratched from decades of micro-impacts, the inner belt caught the distant starlight and threw it back in fragments, a scatter of cold brilliance against the dark. It was not beautiful in any comfortable way. It was not safe. It was the universe, indifferent, vast, full of things that were older and stranger, and in many ways better equipped than the small, stubborn, relentlessly curious species that had decided, without being invited, to come out here and make themselves at home. The species that flew manual when the automation was compromised. The species that took a photograph when someone pointed a weapon at them. The species that picked locks, assembled plans from inadequate materials, stole enemy shuttles because the door was open, drank bad coffee without complaint, and did not, regardless of the odds or the intelligence or the equipment arrayed against them, stop. Wayland set down his cup. "Get some sleep," he told Dex. "Both of you. We've got a station to run." The debrief with Commissioner Gorton happened by secure comm 12 hours later, in the full light of a restored communication relay that was now, once again, carrying the voices of 31 settlements across the rim without interference. Gorton had the data from the module. She had the intelligence team's analysis of the Carter brothers' network, which extended, it turned out, through 4 other rim sectors, with 12 additional human proxies at various levels of the Vethkari operation. 11 of those proxies had been taken into custody within 6 hours of the data reaching Union intelligence. The 12th, the one who had vanished from the base in the early confusion, was still at large. "We'll find him," Gorton said. "What about the Vethkari strategic director?" Wayland asked. "The one at the top of the authorization chain? That name is being taken to the Vethkari conclave directly, under the treaty." Gorton's voice was careful, in the way of someone navigating a very specific diplomatic structure. "The conclave has assured us that unsanctioned operations in Union space are a violation of their own law. This director was acting outside Vethkari government authority." Acting alone, yes, a pause. "The conclave is cooperative. The Vethkari, by and large, are not our enemies, Commander. This was a rogue operation by an individual with ambitions that his own government didn't."
T-sanction.
Wayland thought about the officer in the command node, weapon up, skin cycling through anger. He thought about the voice in the corridor, the business arrangement, the efficiency, the patience. He thought about how old the Vethkari were as a species, how long they had watched humanity arrive in space, with the cheerful recklessness of a species that hadn't worked out yet what it was getting into. "They underestimated us," he said. Gorton was quiet for a moment. "They did. They built a very good system. The remote control device, the invisible operators, the long-term proxies, the hidden base. It was elegant." He paused. "But they built it around the assumption that control of the machines meant control of the people. And humans." He stopped. "We're not the machines." "No," said Gorton, "we're not." The comm closed. Wayland stood at the command console and looked at the tactical display, which was now clean, green across the board, vessels moving on their proper courses, the communication relay humming its steady work, the sector back to the specific, imperfect, living chaos that it was supposed to be. Dex was at the secondary console. He had a paper chart open beside him. Not Survey Route 7, a different one, an approach vector he was working through by hand as a drill, because Wayland had told him to learn the old skills, and Dex was the kind of person who actually did what he was told. Vika Vale had filed her report. The headline had resolved, overnight, to something crisper than 3 sentences. Wayland had read it on the morning relay. It was good. It was exactly right. He wasn't going to tell her that. She'd already figured it out herself. He looked at his hands. Relay station commander's hands. Calloused in the wrong places, knuckle-scarred from a decade of maintenance work, ink-stained from the paper charts. Not impressive by any species standards. Not built for heroics. But they were his, and they were here, and they had done what needed doing. He thought of the humming again, the melody without words. He thought of the long transit in the skimmer, alone in the dark, before the cave mouth opened and the uncertain thing became the certain thing. You couldn't have told him in that moment that it was going to work. You couldn't have given him a guarantee. The universe didn't offer guarantees. It offered the dark and the transit and the question of whether you'd keep moving when you couldn't see the end. He'd kept moving. They all had. That was the thing, in the end. That was always the thing. It wasn't the intellect or the technology or the particular configuration of physical capabilities. It was the keeping moving, the stubborn, irrational, specifically human refusal to accept that the end of what you can see is the same as the end of the road. There were 31 settlements on this relay. 31 communities of people who had built their lives in the dark, at the edge of everything, for reasons that were different for each of them and came down, finally, to the same thing. Because we wanted to. Because we could. Because we are here. Wayland looked at the display. Everything green. Everything moving. Everything alive. He went to make another cup of terrible coffee. Outside, the sector turned in its own slow rotation, ship by ship and station by station, carrying forward the long, irreversible fact of a species that had arrived in space uninvited and declined, on every subsequent occasion, to leave. The night cycle on Gotham Station lasted 6 hours. It was artificial, like everything else out here. The darkness was simply a dimming of the corridor lights and a shift in the atmospheric controls that lowered the temperature by 3 degrees and adjusted the air composition to encourage rest. Nobody had to sleep during it. Nobody was required to obey the biological fiction that the station's designers had built into the systems on. The theory that humans needed circadian signals or they went subtly strange over long postings. Wayland had known people who slept through the day cycle and worked through the night cycle for years without apparent consequence. He'd also known people for whom missing the rhythm by a few hours had produced effects that started as irritability and proceeded, over months, to something more serious. He slept during the night cycle. He had for 20 years. It was discipline, not necessity, and the distinction mattered to him. He did not sleep the night after the base operation. He lay in his bunk and looked at the dark ceiling and listened to the station breathe around him. The mechanical sounds were different since the power surge. The Rue had, in the hours before they'd broken it, been nudging Gotham Station's systems in small ways, testing the edges of what it could control. The environmental regulators had been subtly wrong. The comm filters had been introducing noise at frequencies that fell just outside conscious notice, but not, apparently, outside the body's ability to detect. Gorton's technical team was going through every system on a line-by-line audit, and the corridor outside his quarters hummed with the activity of people who were good at careful work and were doing it carefully. Wayland lay still and thought. He thought about the Vethkari and what Gorton had said. They are not our enemies. He believed that. He believed the conclave, the government, the broader civilization was something humanity could work with, could build something with over the long decades of interstellar proximity that were coming whether anyone was ready or not. He believed it the same way he believed in most things that were true and inconvenient simultaneously, with the full weight of the evidence and without any corresponding reduction in his awareness of what the evidence also showed. The evidence also showed that individual Vethkari, acting without government sanction, had built a sophisticated months-long operation that had inserted human proxies into the life of an innocent researcher, stolen technology that could paralyze an entire sector's navigation, and quietly taken control of dozens of vessels, while the people aboard them felt their hands become useless and their ship become someone else's. That wasn't malice, exactly. The voice in the maintenance corridor had been too calm for malice. It had been something older and in its own way, more unsettling, certainty. The certainty of a perspective so practiced at operating above the level of the small and individual that it had stopped, noticing the small and individual altogether. The hostages hadn't been cruelty. They'd been resource management. You couldn't hate that kind of thinking. Not exactly. You could recognize it. You could refuse to accept it, which was, in the end, what they'd done. He thought about Dex tripping over the power relay. He would never entirely believe it had been an accident. Dex's accidents tended to land in useful places, and while Wayland recognized that this might be survivorship bias, that the useless accidents didn't get remembered as accidents but as failures, and failures were filed differently. He had also watched Dex work for 8 months and formed the opinion that Dex's accidents had a certain quality of inevitability to them. They happened because Dex put himself somewhere that something was going to happen, and then trusted that something useful would occur. It was not a method Wayland had ever been taught. It was not one he would teach. But it produced results, and he had the deep practitioner's respect for results regardless of method. He thought about the paper chart. He had it on his desk now, the hand-drawn corrections still crisp, the pencil marks unsmudged. It would go in the file with the other records. The data module contents, Vika's images, the environmental log from the shuttle. A record of an operation that had worked because of things that weren't supposed to matter anymore. Paper, manual flight, analog photography, the old skills, the backups that nobody thought they needed until the digital layer was compromised, and the new skills were suddenly the liabilities, and the old skills were the only things standing between you and someone else's agenda. He'd asked Gorton, before she'd signed off, whether Union intelligence had found anything that suggested this was isolated. One rogue Vethkari officer, one operation, one sector. Gorton had paused for 2 seconds before answering, which was not the pause of someone saying yes. We're looking at 3 other sectors, she'd said. Different methods, different timelines, but similar architecture, human proxies, technology acquisition, quiet operations over long periods. Another pause. The Tessalon outpost. You remember the Tessalon outpost? Hamill's missing equipment, he said. The RARU, the subspace modulator, the neural interface array. The array is what concerns us now, Gorton said. We've had 2 reports from separate sources of unusual behavioral patterns in a small number of individuals in border settlements. Not conclusive, not yet, but the kind of patterns that would be consistent with a technology that interfaces directly with human neural architecture. Wayland had said nothing for a moment. He'd thought about the brother, the twin who had embedded himself in Hamill's life for 4 years and built a relationship of trust and access from the ground up. He'd thought about what it would look like if you didn't need to do that slowly, over years. If you had a device. How long, he'd said. Until we know? Weeks. Until we can do something about it, if the concern is confirmed. Gorton's voice had been steady, which meant she'd already done the thinking and arrived at the answer and was living with it. We're working on that. He'd thanked her and closed the channel. He lay in the dark and thought, the sector we can see is never the whole problem. The whole problem is always larger. You solve what's in front of you, and when you've solved it, you discover the edges of the next layer. This was not a counsel of despair. This was the fundamental condition of working at the frontier, which was to say, of being human. Because humans were always at a frontier, because the frontier moved outward as fast as they moved toward it, because there was no state of final safety to be arrived at, only the ongoing project of the next defense, the next ingenuity, the next solution to the next problem that had been waiting behind the one you just solved. You didn't arrive. You moved. He thought about 31 settlements. He thought about the names he knew among them, the ones he'd met through his years on Gotham Station, the people whose transmissions he'd relayed and whose emergencies he'd coordinated and whose ordinary daily communications had passed through his station like the content of a river, unread, carrying lives. A farmer on Daraka's world who sent weekly transmissions to her sister on Reach. The medical team on Survey Outpost 9 who checked in every Tuesday with supply requests and the occasional piece of dark humor. The children's school on Settlement 12 who'd sent the relay station a hand-drawn card 2 years ago at the anniversary of the station's founding, thanking them for keeping the lines open. He kept the card in his desk. He hadn't told Dex about the card. He hadn't told Gorton. He hadn't told anyone. It was a small thing, and small things didn't survive being explained. They dissolved under analysis, lost whatever quality made them worth keeping. But he took it out sometimes, in the night cycle, and looked at it. Crayon drawings of stars and a station, drawn as a kind of house floating in space with stick figures in the windows and across the bottom, in the uneven capitals of a 9-year-old. Thank you for connecting us. That was the relay. That was the job. Not the strategy or the defense or the intelligence work, though he did all of those. The underlying thing was this. People far from each other, needing to be connected, and a station in the dark keeping the lines open. He got up at hour 4 of the night cycle and went to the command console. The after-action reports took most of the following duties. There were Union forms for incidents involving non-human intelligences, forms for incidents involving stolen technology, forms for incidents involving hostile action against a Union installation, and forms for incidents involving civilian casualties, which in this case meant the hostages who had all been released, unharmed, and who were each completing their own separate forms in their own separate locations. Wayland worked through the stack with the efficient resignation of a man who had been doing paperwork for 20 years and had made his peace with it. Dex had not made his peace with it. He worked through his forms with the expression of someone dismantling a bomb they hadn't agreed to disarm. He muttered under his breath at intervals. At one point he put his stylus down, looked at the ceiling and said, "Why is there a form for this? Who designs a form for unauthorized appropriation of alien vessel by junior station personnel? Was this anticipated? Did someone think this would happen enough to need a form?" "Second drawer on the left," Wayland said without looking up. "There's also one for unauthorized manual operation of non-human aircraft by certified but unlicensed personnel. You'll need both." Dex stared at him. "The Union has been around for a long time," Wayland said. "They've seen things." Vika Vale did not have forms. She had editors. She was handling her editors on a comm in the media room, and Wayland could hear the conversation at intervals through the corridor. Not the words, just the tone, which was the tone of a journalist who knows exactly what she has and is declining to be rushed or pressured about how she uses it. He respected that enormously. She'd told him, at one point, that she'd been doing this long enough to know that the story wasn't the event. The story was what the event meant. And you couldn't know what it meant until you'd had enough time to look at it from all sides. The editors wanted the images up now, the image of the Vethkari officer especially, weapon raised in the red light of an illegal base, which was the kind of image that had never existed in the public record before, and which would land like a dropped stone in still water. She understood that. She also understood that a stone dropped too quickly, without context, would produce ripples of the wrong shape. "I'll have it right," Wayland had heard her say, on the second day, with the quiet certainty of someone who had been right before and knew what it felt like. "Give me until I'm satisfied." They'd given her until she was satisfied. On the third day, the full report went out. Text, images, the full contextual briefing she'd assembled from Wayland's account, and the public portions of Gorton's statement, and her own 312 photographs from the shuttle. It went out to every news service that mattered in the rim sectors, and it went out to several that mattered beyond the rim, and within 18 hours, it had been picked up by every major Union media channel. The image was exactly what she'd said it would be. A photograph, taken on analog equipment in the emergency red light of an alien base, of the moment a Vethkari officer faced two humans and a camera and chose, for a specific set of reasons that the accompanying text explained carefully and without editorializing, to lower his weapon. The headline was 4 words: "They underestimated us." Again, Commissioner Gorton sent a personal comm on day 4. It was brief and direct, in Gorton style. "Your request for additional station armament has been approved. Your request for a second junior officer has been approved. Your recommendation that all sector relay stations in the Outer Rim upgrade to manual override capability on all critical systems has been escalated to the Union Infrastructure Committee and will be reviewed within 60 days. A pause. The Carter brothers have cooperated with intelligence. The Vethkari Conclave has provided formal assurance of full cooperation in the broader investigation. The neural interface array is a priority concern and we are treating it accordingly." She paused again, and this pause was different from the careful ones. This one had a quality Wayland associated with things she was choosing to say rather than required to say. "You did well," she said, "both of you." Another beat. "The card on your desk. I've seen it. Different version, different station, but the same impulse. Someone who remembered why. Don't lose that." The comm closed. Wayland sat with it for a moment. Then he went back to his forms. On day 5, Dex walked into the command room with a paper chart under his arm and a look of someone who has decided to do something and is committing to the decision with the full-body certainty of youth. "Survey Route 9, he said, laying the chart on the console beside Wayland. "It connects to Route 7 at the secondary waypoint. If you follow it through the outer debris margin, there's a gap in the sensor coverage, about 30 minutes of dead zone travel. I want to run it manually. Practice." Wayland looked at the chart. "I tripped on the power relay," Dex said. "I know you did. I want to be able to do it on purpose next time. Wayland looked at him, 23 years old. Smart in the way of someone who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of being smart. Committed with the whole body commitment that was either a profound strength or a terminal liability, and still hadn't been sorted into which. He thought both. It's both. Take the survey skimmer, he said. Manual helm, no automation, chart only. No comm check-ins. If you get in trouble, you get yourself out. Return before the end of the day cycle. He paused. If you come back here having tripped over another power relay, I will require a written explanation. Dex picked up his chart and went. The station settled into its ordinary rhythms. The relay hummed. Transmissions came in and went out. 31 settlements, their voices and their data and their needs in their ordinary daily lives, passing through Gotham Station in the endless stream of a civilization that was alive and connected and didn't know or need to know how the connection was maintained. Vika Vale appeared in the doorway of the command room with her imager bag and a jacket that meant she was heading out. My shuttle to Reach is in 3 hours, she said. I wanted to say goodbye before I had forms to sign. You have forms to sign. I know. I'm going to sign them from Reach and mail them in. She looked at him with the gray-green eyes that missed nothing. You're going to be all right here. We're a relay station. That's not what I meant, she paused. What you did, going into that base alone, with nothing to look for those people. That's not standard protocol. No, but you did it anyway. Someone had to. She looked at him for a long moment. That's what I mean, she said. That's exactly what I mean. She adjusted the strap of her imager bag. I'll file the follow-up piece when the intelligence investigation reaches its next stage. I'll want to talk to you again. I'll be here, said Wayland. That's the thing about you relay people, she said at the door. You're always here. She meant it as a compliment. It landed as one. He watched her go. The command console was quiet. The display was green. The relay carried its burden of voices through the dark between stars, patient and constant, the way a bridge carries weight, not feeling it, not knowing it, just holding. Wayland pulled open the second drawer on the left and took out the children's card. Crayon stars, a house floating in space, stick figures in the windows. Thank you for connecting us. He looked at it for a moment. He put it back. He opened the new armament requisition form, filled in his station's coordinates and crew complement, and noted in the purpose field, long-term sector defense, with particular attention to manual override capability for all navigation-adjacent systems. The work continued. The relay hummed. Outside, the sector turned in its slow circle, and the settlements turned with it. And in 31 places that humans had decided to call home, people were talking to each other across the dark, not knowing and not needing to know that two people on a station they'd never seen had, with paper charts and borrowed instincts, and the unshakable human conviction that the road goes forward even when you can't see it, kept the lines open. Wayland made his terrible coffee. He sat at the console. He did not hum, but the melody was there, ready if he needed it. He didn't need it today. Today, the dark was just the dark, and the station was just the station, and the work was just the work. Imperfect, ongoing, and exactly enough. The neural interface array surfaced 3 weeks later. Gorton calmed at the start of the day cycle, which meant it was urgent enough to override the protocol of waiting for working hours. Wayland was already awake. He'd taken to rising an hour early since the operation, not from anxiety but from a recalibration of his sense of the day's proper weight. The early hour was for the things that needed thinking rather than doing. The thinking was free. Settlement 8, Gorton said. The medical team has flagged 4 individuals showing behavioral concordance, specific changes in decision-making patterns, a particular kind of compliance, not enough to notice individually. Together, the medical team says it looks like an overlay. She paused. They're calling it a signal. Wayland was at the console by then, pulling up Settlement 8's relay data. 31 days of transmissions. He started from the beginning and ran the metadata. Sender, recipient, timestamp, signal strength, routing path. Most of it was ordinary, the daily flow of a small community living its small life. But there were 3 transmissions that had been routed through an intermediary node he didn't recognize. And when he tracked the node, it resolved to coordinates in the inner belt, different coordinates than the wizard's base, farther in, closer to the primary. Same sector, different location, Wayland said. 2 operations, Gorton confirmed. The RU was the first layer. The neural array is the second. The RU gave them vehicle control. The array gives them people control, Wayland said. The word sat in the air. Not fully, Gorton said, careful. From what the medical team can reconstruct, it's more subtle than that. It doesn't command. It inclines. It makes certain decisions seem more natural. Certain resistances seem more costly. It works with the existing personality rather than against it. She stopped. It's elegant, she said, with the specific loathing of someone who respects the craft and detests the purpose. Wayland thought about the 4-year proxy, the brother who had embedded himself in Hamill's life, building trust from the ground up. He thought about how long that had taken, how much human time had been invested in something that the array could apparently replicate in weeks, with the right signal profile. Settlement 8 is still in my relay coverage, he said. Yes. I can get there in 4 hours at standard transit speed. Manual helm. He paused. I'll need a medical team. I'm sending one with enforcement. They'll meet you there in 6 hours. I'll be there in 4, he told Dex. He left Dex in charge of the station with a list of protocols and a physical key for the manual override, and a single instruction. If anything tries to take the relay, use the override, and then use the paper charts, and then figure it out as you go. You trust me with the whole station, Dex said. You landed a Vethkari shuttle manually after tripping over a power relay, Wayland said. You've earned the station. He flew to Settlement 8 in 4 hours, hands on a manual helm, the hum behind his lips and the dark outside the window and the distant stars for company. He thought about overlays. He thought about the particular shape of the human capacity for self-determination, and how much of civilization was, when you examined it carefully, a series of structures designed to protect that capacity from other humans, and how entirely new the challenge was of protecting it from a technology that operated below the threshold of noticing. Settlement 8 was a mining community of 240 people in a series of pressurized habitats carved into a carbonaceous asteroid. They grew food in hydroponic bays and mined trace metals and sent their children to school, in a repurposed equipment bay with crayon drawings on the walls. When Wayland docked and identified himself, the settlement coordinator came to meet him personally, a weathered woman named Pen Harros, with the hands of someone who had spent decades doing physical work, and the eyes of someone who had spent decades thinking about what the physical work was for. How many of my people, she asked, not loudly, privately in the docking corridor before anyone else could hear. The medical team is looking for a specific pattern, Wayland said. We don't have a confirmed number. We're here to check, and to remove the source if we find it. And the 4 that your people already flagged? Unharmed. The effect appears to be reversible when the signal is removed. He paused. They didn't know. None of them knew. I want you to understand that. This wasn't choice or weakness or failure. It was a technology operating below conscious awareness. Harros looked at him for a long moment. In her face he could see the full complexity of what he'd just told her. The relief, the horror, the anger, and underneath all of it, the specific fear of the person who is responsible for a community and has just learned that something was happening to that community without her knowing. Find it, she said. Get it out. He found it in the asteroid's deep infrastructure, in the transmitter array used for long-range mineral survey, which had been subtly modified to carry a secondary signal alongside its standard output. The modification was recent, small, and would have been missed in any routine inspection. He had been looking for it specifically, with eyes trained by the previous 3 weeks, and even he almost missed it. He pulled the array offline. He documented everything. He sent the data package to Gorton and waited for the medical team. The medical team arrived in 2 hours and 20 minutes, which was faster than their stated ETA, which told him they'd pushed their transit hard. The effect began to resolve within hours of the signal being removed. The medical team described it as a fog lifting, not dramatic, not sudden, but a progressive return to the full range of natural response. Decisions that had been inclining in particular directions began to open back up. People looked at each other and had the disorienting experience of noticing, in retrospect, that something had been wrong. One of the 4 flagged individuals, a young mining engineer named Solan, who had been, according to his colleagues, inexplicably cooperative about a renegotiated work contract that severely disadvantaged his team, sat in the medical bay and put his face in his hands and didn't say anything for a long moment. I thought I'd just changed my mind, he said. I thought it was my decision. Wayland sat with him. He didn't offer false comfort. He offered what he had, which was, it's recoverable. The decision is recoverable. Your mind is recoverable. How do you know? Solan said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. Because the signal is gone, Wayland said. And you're the one asking the question. Whatever that thing was doing, it couldn't touch the part of you that knows when something isn't right. Solan looked at him. I didn't know, he said. That's the whole point. I didn't know. You know now, Wayland said. It wasn't enough. It wasn't close to enough. But it was true, and true was what he had. The second Vethkari base was smaller than the first. It had been designed for a longer, quieter operation, not the kind that made dramatic gestures, but the kind that worked slowly over years, inclining, adjusting, producing outcomes at a remove so that the cause and the effect were never visible in the same frame. It surrendered without incident when Gorton's enforcement team arrived. The operator, a single Vethkari technician, no human proxies this time, just one being in an array and a very long plan, made the Vethkari gesture that Gorton's interpreter described as analogous to resignation, though with specific overtones that translated more precisely as, "I am surprised it took you this long." Wayland read that in the report and sat with it. Surprised it took you this long. That was the thing, wasn't it? That was the thing he'd been turning over since the maintenance corridor, since the voice had said, "We are efficient, we are patient, we have time." The Vethkari who did this weren't doing it from malice. They were doing it from a perspective in which humans were not irrelevant, not dismissed, but readable, predictable. A system with known parameters that could be influenced at the edges in ways that produced useful outcomes. You didn't need to fight a system like that. You didn't need to conquer it. You just needed to understand it well enough to nudge it in the direction you wanted. Except humans were the species that had figured out, without being told, that the signal didn't come from inside themselves. Solon had thought he'd changed his mind. The 4 individuals in Settlement 8 had believed, for weeks, that they were simply making natural decisions in the direction of natural outcomes. They had felt the compliance as their own. They hadn't known. But when the signal was removed, the first thing every one of them had done was ask what had happened. Had asked, was that real? Was that me? How do I know? That was the parameter that was hard to model. That was the thing the long patience and the elegant technology didn't fully account for. Not the capacity to resist in a dramatic, obvious way, but the itch. The deep-down human itch that said, wait, something isn't adding up, and I don't have the words for it yet, but I'm going to keep pulling at this thread until I do. The medical team flagged it, not because they were looking for behavioral overlay technology. They didn't know that was possible. They flagged it because the pattern was wrong. 4 people in a small community, showing a specific concordance that didn't match normal social influence. It was statistically improbable. It was the kind of thing you dismissed if you only looked once, but the medical team had looked twice. Because that's what humans do. They look twice. They pull at the thread. Wayland wrote this in his report, not as a conclusion but as an observation. He didn't dress it up. He just put it there. The system that anticipated human predictability did not adequately account for the human tendency to notice that things are wrong before having any ability to articulate why. This observation may be relevant to future assessments of similar operations. Gorton calmed him after she'd read the report. She didn't say anything about that section specifically. She said, noted, which was enough. The weeks became months. The armament arrived, not much by military standards, but appropriate for a relay station that was now formally classified as a strategic node rather than just infrastructure. Wayland ran the installation himself, partly to know exactly what was where, and partly because physical work with his hands remained. After 20 years, the best thinking medium he had. The second junior officer arrived, a woman named Sean Carver, who was 26, and had spent 3 years on a border installation and had a gift for systems diagnostics that bordered on the intuitive. She could listen to a relay network and tell you which node was running warm by the quality of the signal. She was quiet in the way of people who had been in dangerous places and made their peace with the danger, and she got on with Dex with the efficient ease of 2 people who respected competence more than personality. Wayland watched them work together for a week and decided he was very lucky. Not because they were extraordinary. He'd worked with extraordinary people, people whose gifts were so specific and so sharp that they functioned like specialized tools, brilliant in their narrow lane and fragile outside it. Carver and Dex were not like that. They were the rarer thing, adaptable. The kind of people who didn't need to understand every variable to function well inside the system. They learned as they went. They adjusted. They caught each other's gaps without ego or resentment. The kind of people who could fly manual when the automation failed. He trained them both on the paper charts. He started with Survey Route 7. He had them calculate the approach vectors by hand, work out the attitude adjustments, plot the returns. He did not tell them it was because manual navigation was an obsolete skill that might save their lives someday. He told them it was because understanding the fundamentals of what the automation was doing, at the level of pencil and paper, made you a better operator of the automation, which was also true. But Dex knew, and after the first session, Carver figured it out. She looked at him across the navigation table with its spread charts and said, "This is because it works when the digital doesn't." "Correct," said Wayland. "How often does the digital fail?" He thought about the Rue. He thought about the subtle modification in Settlement 8's survey array. He thought about the voice in the corridor and the shadow without a body and the invisible hand on the shuttle door. "Often enough," he said, "that you want to be glad you practiced." On a Tuesday in the 7th month after the operation, a Tuesday in the artificial sense, in the arbitrary calendar that humans had extended from Earth time to the settlements, because the brain likes to know what day it is, Wayland received a transmission from Settlement 12. It was from the school. It was from the same class that had sent the card, or the year's version of that class. Some of the same children, now a year older, plus new ones. They'd heard about the operation. They'd heard about the relay station and the 2 people who'd kept it running. They sent a new drawing. It was a child's drawing of a relay station in space in crayon. But this one was different from the original. In this one, the station had windows with stick figures in them, the same as before. But around the station, in the space between the station and the stars, there were other shapes. Spiky and angular, alien, unmistakably Vethkari as filtered through a child's interpretation of a news report. And the stick figures in the windows were not hiding from them. They were facing them. They were small. The alien shapes were bigger. And across the bottom, in new handwriting and new capitals, "We know you will keep the lines open." Wayland looked at the drawing for a long time. He put it in the drawer. With the first one, he went to the console. The relay hummed. 31 settlements, their voices and their lives, and their extraordinary ordinary persistence in the dark, moving through his station on their way to each other. He kept the lines open. He always had. He always would, for as long as he was here, and after him, someone else would, and after them, someone else. The dark was the dark. The work was the work. The humans were at the frontier where they had always been, pulling at the threads of everything that wasn't quite adding up, flying manual when the automation failed, looking twice at the things that looked wrong, keeping the lines open between the people who needed to be connected. Wayland made his coffee. He drank it at the console. It was terrible, as always. He was exactly where he was supposed to be.